It was the mid-18th century. Great empires around the world were busy expanding their power and influence. The most prominent of these was the British Empire, which had come to control territories in many regions of the globe. Britain was planting its flags not only across Europe but also in Asia, Africa, and America. In particular, the 13 colonies in North America were regarded as extremely valuable to Britain. These colonies were important because of their fertile lands, natural resources, and trade routes. At first, the relationship between the British government and the American colonies was relatively good. Britain considered them its subjects and expected their loyalty, while American settlers viewed Britain as their protector. But over time, that relationship began to change. The people in the colonies began to see themselves as a nation with a distinct identity, wanting to prosper through their own labor and resources. On the other hand, Britain wanted the colonies to serve solely as a means to strengthen its own economy. Britain imposed various laws on the American colonies, known as the Navigation Acts. Under these laws, America was allowed to trade only with Britain. Colonial farmers and merchants had to send their goods, such as tobacco, cotton, and timber, only to Britain, and in return, they had to buy from Britain the goods they needed. This policy restricted colonial trade and deprived the colonies of economic freedom. The American people were not happy about this. They wanted to be able to sell their produce to other European countries as well, so they could earn higher profits. But Britain's policy forced them into a circle where only Britain benefited from their labor. In the 1760s, Britain and France fought the 7 Years' War, which ended in Britain's favor. As a result of that war, France handed over many of its territories to Britain, especially Canada and parts of Eastern America. It was a major victory for Britain, but the war had emptied the British treasury. Now Britain needed money to maintain its army and administration. The Parliament in London decided that the best solution was to collect more taxes from the American colonies. They reasoned that since the colonies had been freed from the French threat by the war, they should be grateful to Britain and not hesitate to pay extra taxes. In 1765, the Stamp Act was implemented, under which every official document, newspaper, book, and even playing cards had to bear a British government stamp, and a fee had to be paid for it. This was a shock to the Americans. They were already suffering because of restricted trade, and now a direct tax was being imposed on them. The American people protested vigorously against this tax. Demonstrations were held in many places. Effigies of British officials were burned, and slogans were raised at public gatherings: "No taxation without representation." This slogan meant that the American colonies had no representatives in the British Parliament. They asked, "If we don't have the vote or representation, why should we accept the decisions of the British Parliament?" The protests were so intense that Britain was eventually forced to repeal the Stamp Act. But this was only a temporary relief. Britain was not going to back down from its economic policies. At that time, tea was not only a beverage, but also a social symbol. People in America considered drinking tea a mark of status and respectability. It was the most popular commodity coming from Britain. Millions of pounds of tea were imported into America every year, bringing substantial revenue to British companies. Britain thought that if it wanted to tax something, tea would be a suitable choice, because people would not be able to give it up. Thus, in 1773, the Tea Act was passed, which required Americans to buy tea only from Britain's East India Company and to pay duty on it. This decision tested the Americans' patience to the limit. For them, it was not just a tax on tea, but an attack on their freedom and dignity. When the tea tax law reached the American colonies, sorrow and anger spread among the people. On the surface, it seemed like a small tax, but the message behind it was far more dangerous. The American people realized that if they accepted this tax today, Britain could tomorrow impose duties on everything, and they would be forever shackled in servitude. Public gatherings were held in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and other large cities. People assembled in open grounds and churches to listen to speeches. The most prominent slogan in those speeches was, "No taxation without representation." In these meetings, Leaders explained to the people that this tax was not only about tea, but a robbery of their freedom and dignity. They warned that if they remained silent today, tomorrow their land, their trade, and the labor of their children would all fall under British control. At the same time, a secret organization emerged called the Sons of Liberty. This group mainly consisted of young people, merchants, and political activists. Its purpose was to organize the public against British injustices and to take practical action. The Sons of Liberty began holding secret meetings at night. They made plans, distributed pamphlets, and prepared the public for protest. Their single aim was to stand up against British oppression. The American people decided to carry out a total boycott of British tea. Slogans in the markets read, "Don't buy British tea." Shops were pressured not to sell East India Company tea. Women also played an active role in this movement. In households, people began to drink coffee and other beverages instead of tea. This was not just an economic boycott, but a practical struggle for freedom. At the end of 1773, several East India Company ships arrived at American ports, carrying millions of pounds of tea. Britain wanted the tea to be sold in America at all costs, but the public reaction was strong. At many ports, people prevented the ships from docking. However, the situation at Boston's harbor became particularly tense. The British governor Thomas Hutchinson announced that none of the ships could leave and that the tea had to be unloaded in any case. This proclamation was a direct challenge to the public. On the evening of December 16, 1773, thousands gathered at Boston's Old South Meeting House. This public meeting was the largest of its time. People loudly declared, "We will not bow to British oppression." The meeting lasted for many hours, and finally it was decided that if the governor did not allow the ships to leave, the people would take action themselves. The streets of Boston that night presented a different picture. There was much whispering and debate. Some argued for continued protest. Others believed the time for direct action had come. Every eye reflected anger, and every heart was full of resolve. Meanwhile, some members of the Sons of Liberty decided to strike directly at the ships, but they wanted to avoid open warfare, so they planned to disguise themselves as local American residents. They thought that if the British government investigated, they would not be able to lay direct blame on these men. Under the cover of darkness, dozens of men, faces painted and wearing headdresses decorated with bird feathers, made their way toward Boston Harbor. They carried axes and clubs. Secretly, they were prepared for the historic action that would later become famous as the Boston Tea Party.